Hi there everyone, and welcome to the Negotiations Podcast, where today we will be talking about negotiation within the trade union movement, and how you, as reps, can negotiate as professionally and effectively as possible in the ever-changing world of work. My name is Ben Richards. I'll be your host today, and joining me is trade union tutor Simon Farrar. Throughout the podcast, we'll be taking short breaks to tell you some of the great services we are exclusively offering to community reps. So make sure to listen until the end so you don't miss them. Without further ado, let's get on with the show.
I thought it would be good to sort of set the trend of what we're trying to do today. And if we maybe both give an idea of what we believe the purpose of negotiating to be, and that might give us a good overview of kind of the things we're going to be talking about today. So personally, from my perspective and a trade union perspective, negotiating is really the sort of formal procedures you find yourself in when discussing sort of terms and conditions, for instance. Collective bargaining is obviously massive, but negotiating is really around those hard issues such as pay, contractual changes, or of course, you might have to negotiate in other situations you find yourself in that involve employees, such as slightly with disciplinaries as well. You can have sort of certain tactics are used in there. I mean, it's not as mainstream, but definitely elements of negotiating need to be used within those settings as well. And there's obviously a big difference between consultation and negotiating. And consultation is that discussion you have with employers and the union to sort of air those views and have a nice discussion about both sides' opinions, and then maybe come to an agreement. Whereas negotiating is much more of a hardline stance, and it's much more of a democratic way of coming to a solution rather than consultation, which is a bit more of a discussion than a hardline democracy. I've really thrown a spanner there, Simon. So give us your sort of purpose of negotiating, if it must then.
Well, some similarities, but I take a slightly different view, I think, to what you're saying, because I try and separate out negotiations and negotiating. And one of the things I often talk to people about, and I've always taken this approach myself, and this is where I differ, I think, around this definition of consultation. If you take negotiations, that's the formal process of trying to reach an agreement where both parties have to sign off on something. If you're not in that, if, say, the trade union doesn't have to sign off and the employer doesn't need the trade union to say yes or and come to an agreement, then I think you're in consultations. Because, the power always rests with the employer. And if the employer doesn't need an agreement from the union, then you're in consultations. But this is where I differ. So I differentiate between negotiations, consultations, which are those two technical things. You need the union to agree, you don't need the union to agree. And negotiating, because for me, negotiating can happen at any point. It can happen in negotiations, it can happen in consultation, it can even happen when the employer is just sharing information with you. Because negotiating, for me, is using your skill set and the circumstances to change the way somebody else thinks and feels. I'm trying to change the way they view the world. And so I could be in a negotiation around pay. I could be in a consultation around health and safety. I could be in a disciplinary. I could be in a grievance. I could even be in an appraisal appeal. But if I'm trying to change the way that manager or those managers think and feel, or even other unions that are, if we're in a multi-union workplace, if I'm trying to change the way they think and feel around the world, I think I'm negotiating. And I think if you think about it like that, it changes the way you respond. So management comes to say, we'd like a consultation around the new health and safety policy. And you go, okay, they're not going to negotiate. They have the power. The legislation says they should consult. Brilliant. But I'm trying to change the way they think. So I'm negotiating. They can call it what the hell they like. But if I have that internal view that I'm always negotiating. You give me the chance to open my mouth, then I'm negotiating. And I just think having that mindset gives you more power. It gives you some kind of moral authority a little bit to engage with the employer. They can call it what the hell they like, but I'm going to negotiate with you because I want to change the way you think.
Yeah, that's excellent. Love that.
It's a very traditional, the example you gave is a very traditional example of being trapped into the definitions given to us by the employers. We're in negotiation, so we have to get an agreement. We're in consultation, so we don't, so there will be no negotiations. Yeah, there bloody well will be, because, sorry for the language, but there will be. That's my attitude. I'm going to negotiate with you, whether you want me to or not. And yeah. I think you're right. Your definition was that very traditional, allowing the employer to differentiate. And it should be up to me whether I'm being negotiated or not, whether I'm negotiating. That should be my choice as the trade union rep, not theirs.
Yeah. And it's about, as you said, using that skill set to change the way they think and benefit you as the trade union. So, or yourself, if you're doing it on, for self reason, but it's to get that benefit and the impact you want. So I love the way that you said there, there's no way you're not negotiating because you're constantly trying to, change the way they think to get a result you want or to get the outcome you want. Yeah. So I think that was fantastically described there.
And actually, Ben, it might not even be on that topic. So you might think, do you know what? This is not a huge issue for us. It's not a huge issue for the membership. Don't really, we don't want to spend a lot of time and effort negotiating on this. But actually, the way they think and feel about this, the way they think and feel about the union, we can change that here. We've got an opportunity to influence their thinking on this other topic over here. So I should be sophisticated enough. I should have that in my head that this is a chance to engage in some dialogue, change their attitude to me, change their attitude to the union, change their attitude to my members or a particular group of members. So I'm going to use this consultation process to negotiate with them on that other thing over there, because everything's connected. And if I don't see the connections, then they're not going to see the connections. So it's about recognizing. I think, what would they call it? Nudge theory, I think. So I'm trying to nudge you in a particular direction without you quite realizing that's what I'm trying to do. So I use this forum to nudge you in that direction for that other forum, the topic over there.
Yeah, no, superb. Love that, Simon. So thank you for that. So we're just going to move on to sort of our first topic to discuss. Mm-hmm. And it's around the context of negotiations. So firstly, I was wondering if you could provide me with sort of an overview of the different employer and management styles used in the context of negotiating.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of management theory practices out there, and it's just useful, I think, sometimes as a negotiator to understand that, because for one of the key things is to understand the relationship. And I've always tried to recognise that I think there are more relationships in collective bargaining than we sometimes give credit for. So there's definitely a relationship between the employer and the trade union or trade unions. And and we recognise that. And then we sometimes remember that we've got a relationship with our members and we've got a relationship a little bit with non-members, because obviously we want to try and convince them the benefits of membership. So we ought to think about that as a relationship. Often, sometimes what gets missed is the relationship between the employer and the workers, staff.
Yeah.
And we forget sometimes that that's a different relationship than the one with the trade union. And so we have to recognize that, and management have different styles to how they run that relationship. So the most common style at the moment is what we would call human resource management. And I think there are the fundamental principle behind HRM, human resource management, is that staff are the most important resource. And you hear this a lot from HR, and you hear this a lot from managers. The staff are our most important resource. But I think there are two styles of HRM. I think there's hard HRM and soft HRM. And the way I've tried to think about this is like a little bit like fossil fuels and renewable energy. So hard HRM says staff are our most valuable resource, so exploit them. Exploit that resource till there's nothing left. And then once there's nothing left, we've squeezed every last ounce from that member of staff or that group of workers, cast them aside because we can get others in. And then you get sort of the opposite to that in HRM is soft HRM, so soft human resource management, where they sort of say, yes, staff are our most valuable resource, but what we really want to do here is nurture and grow and build that resource and use it as to the best of our ability, and we want it to be long lasting, and we want it to benefit us as an employer as long as possible. And in some instances, that means we need to benefit the employees or the staff, and we'll talk about co-workers and we'll talk about colleagues. And sometimes that's used to undermine the trade union movement, because from the staff perspective, from the worker perspective, it looks like a very caring employer. And it's still about exploiting the resource, but it's done in a much softer, gentler way. So we need to understand that as trade unions when we're collective bargaining, because it might be therefore that we think the employer is being horrible and he's exploiting staff, but staff don't feel it like that. They don't see what's happening behind the scenes, and they just see the sort of kind front. So we're saying the employer's horrible, look what they're doing, and our membership are going, yeah, no, but they care about us, and we've got this package, and they're giving us this, and we've got these other benefits, non-pay benefits. So soft HRM can be used not just as a management of staff, but it can be used as a way of undermining the perception of the union and the strength of the union. I think the other ones that we sometimes see are what I would call paternalistic. You see that a little bit in some traditional sectors. So things like, I think Rolls-Royce traditionally had a very paternalistic, Cadbury's from the Quaker background had a very paternalistic view. So we're the adult, we're the parent in this employer-worker relationship. We know best. We know what's best for the company. We know what's best for you. We know what's best on safety, on pay, on conditions. And again, I think you can see differences. So it's a bit like different styles of parenting. So you get the really hard parents, do as you're told. You don't do as you're told immediately, you're going to get punished. So that very hard parenting approach. And then you get the softer parenting approach where it's much more about a partnership and a relationship. So we see paternalism. Often in paternalism, they'll try and offer lots of benefits away from paying conditions. So, social activities and social functions and a nice canteen and a table tennis table in the corridors, because we care about you.
Masking the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Masking the issues, masking the real problems. Again, for a trade union, that can be quite difficult because the employer looks very caring, whereas in reality, they might not be. So again, understanding that relationship changes the collective bargaining, changes the relationship with the trade union. Obviously, you get things like what we would call adversarial. They just want to fight all the time just for the sake of having a fight. They want to fight with staff. They want to fight with workers. They want to fight with the trade union. And you could get that in hard HRM, and you can get that in hard paternalism, where the parent, we know best, don't argue with us sort of stuff.
I suppose the styles blend, don't they, at times as well?
They overlap.
They cross over. So.
Yeah, they overlap a lot. And sometimes what you see, I used to see this a lot in education, so negotiating as a trade unionist in further education, for example, or even as a manager in further education, you would see a difference in different points of the organisation. So, HR might be talking very soft HRM, but then you've got a chief exec or a principal who was taking a much more hard HRM, and then you'd find individual managers who were just out and out adversarial. And what I would have to work out as a negotiator, I think, was Why is that different? Is that something that's being supported centrally? So a central management, the senior leadership team, the senior managers, deliberately encouraging different styles to unsettle, unbalance collectivism, to unbalance the trade union? Or is it just that those managers aren't particularly good and they're just horrible people and I read some theory. There's a guy called McGregor did some research in the 70s and he looked at the psychology of managers. And he said he came up with this idea that fundamentally there are two opposing views of how you manage staff. And most people fall somewhere between the two views. He called them X and Y managers, I think. So X managers fundamentally believe that all workers are lazy, idle, work shy, untrustworthy, and they only respond to punishment or reward. So the only way you can manage staff is bribe them with terms and conditions or benefits, or you punish them for the slightest infraction. So he said there's that type of managers. They just fundamentally don't trust anybody. And they said at the other end, you have these sort of what he called Y managers, who sort of, they believe everybody's wonderful and lovely. And if only we cared about people and showed that we cared, they'd all work really, really hard and they'd be as productive as possible. And obviously, in reality, you've got some people who only respond to punishment or bribery. And equally, you only get some workers who really need to be cared for. And if you cared for them, they work really hard. I mean, we're talking about people, aren't we? So, yeah, it's a whole range of people. But I think sometimes you have to work out, am I dealing with a manager who doesn't have the skills to be a manager? And I see this a lot we see a lot in the health service, but I see it a lot in some of the international organisations I work with. They promote people on technical knowledge, not managerial skills. So you might be a brilliant nurse, or you might be a brilliant academic, or you know your subject really well, or you're a brilliant engineer, you're the best engineer, so we're going to make you a manager. Well, can you actually manage people? No.
Totally different world.
No. And are we going to train you to do that? No, because managers are meant to learn how to do this stuff by osmosis. They absorb it somehow. I don't know. So I always have to try and work out, is this because the manager doesn't have the skill set? Is it because they don't have the knowledge? Is it because they're an X manager? Is it because they're a Y manager? Because there are problems with Y managers as well, not making decisions, not giving people direction, not giving you a straight answer when you're negotiating with them. Or is it some kind of deliberate tactic? Are they, and do you know what I think is one of the hardest things to work out as a negotiator? Are they evil? Or are they just rubbish and incompetent? And which is it? And sometimes that's hard to work out because that might change my response. So yeah,
and a lot of the time, I would assume that they're in the middle as well. So they're a bit of both. And I would actually assume that maybe a long-established manager who is quite good at their job would be somewhere in the middle, would be the best. It's about being able to identify that and being able to work it to your advantage, to pick up on those styles and impact the negotiation to benefit you via that.
Yeah, and of course, if you're negotiating somebody that's trained to negotiate, then they're going to adapt their negotiating style. I mean, when I'm teaching negotiation skills, actually, when I'm teaching management skills, so I teach people how to manage trade unions, for example. One of the things I always talk about is you don't have a style. I might have an overall set of principles, but I don't have a managerial style. I don't have a negotiating style. They change depending on the circumstances and who I'm managing or who I'm negotiating. So if you're a trade union negotiator, you have to recognize that some of the people you're negotiating with have been trained how to negotiate. And so the way they're negotiating with you might be different to the way they negotiate with somebody. I mean, a lot of them aren't. Let's be honest. I've negotiated with so many managers that had clearly never been trained. But sometimes you come across some and you think, well, wow. So I've recently started negotiating with diplomats. I've had to negotiate with ambassadors. They're trained negotiators, and you can see it sometimes. You can see that the way they talk to me is different than the way they talk to the president of the union, for example. And you sort of think, oh, okay. And that's because they're changing their style depending on who they're talking to or what they're talking about. So you have to look for that. You have to look for those different approaches.
And we need to do it as well, don't we?
Ben, I just talk about gender dynamic here, because I think it's important we recognise that there's a gender dynamic to negotiations as well. That, the way that, let's be an assertive negotiator from a man might be seen differently. That behaviour might be seen differently for a woman, and we have to recognise there's a lot of gender discrimination and gender bias in the way that managers particularly would treat trade union reps based on the gender of the rep. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to look for that, and we need to take steps to tackle that. So there's all this sort of interpersonal dynamic, relationship dynamic happening that you sort of have to try and be switched onto a little bit when you're negotiating, whether it's one-to-one or on a collective issue.
The coronavirus pandemic has completely changed the way we negotiate. What was once discussed across the table is now done over a computer screen. To help you navigate the technical hurdles of online negotiations, we've created a guide on how to use Zoom. Zoom is one of the most popular online communication tools, and our guide walks you through how to create an account, download the app onto your phone or computer, set up meetings, and manage conversations with large groups of people. Whether you're virtually negotiating for pay or keeping in touch with loved ones, grab a free copy of our guide today by emailing education@community-tu.org. That's education@community-tu.org.
What would your advice be on what people should look for, the main things they should look for in negotiating styles, with who they're negotiating with, I suppose?
Well, there's two things that I think we need to think about. One is the relationship, and one is trust, for want of a better description. So I want to try and understand what the relationship is. I want to understand, and within relationship, we have to think about power. So how much power and authority do they have? How much power and authority do I have? What's the mechanisms around that relationship? Is the relationship guided by some kind of structural approach? This is the pay bargaining, so it's got this structure to it. This is a disciplinary process, so it has this structure to it. So I think I always look at the relationship because I want to work on that and I want to build on that. And that might be what sort of level of honesty am I getting? What sort of level of reliability? If they say they're going to do it, will they do it? Are they evasive? Are they accurate in what they tell me? Are they very vague in what they're telling me? But early on, when I meet somebody new that I'm negotiating with, I'm trying to feel them out. I hate the sports analogies, but it's a little bit like, so I bowl spin bowling, and I apologise to anybody that doesn't follow cricket. But one of the things you do as a spin bowler when you get a new batsman is I have 3 deliveries. I bowl at a new batsman. And what I'm trying to do is work out the strengths and weaknesses of that player's skill set. Just from those 3 balls. So I know if I bowl these 3 balls, the way they react to those 3 balls tells me a lot about them as a batsman, about their skills, about their psychology. And that's what I'm trying to do when I meet somebody new as a negotiator. I'm trying to look at their skills, their psychology, and their attitudes towards the topic and me. And so I'm trying to feel that out early on in interactions. And I spend a lot of time watching people in new negotiations. I'm much more observational. And by observational, I mean listening as well. So looking at them, watching them, and listening to them. The challenges of negotiating over Zoom and Microsoft Teams, for example, can make it really quite difficult. So I try and pin, if I can have control, when I'm trying to pin that speaker. So there's a function on Teams, I think, and Zoom, where you can make sure that the person speaking is always up on your screen. And I'm trying to look at that. I try to have the gallery view up as well on negotiation, so I can see the other people because I want to watch who I'm negotiating with. I want to look at their facial expressions, their body language, and listen to their tone because I'm trying to work them out. Because I don't negotiate with an organisation. I don't negotiate with Rolls-Royce. I negotiate with a manager at Rolls-Royce. I don't negotiate with Group 4 Securities. I negotiate with a manager at Group 4 Securities. So that's who I'm negotiating with, and I try and work them out early on. And then you can start to think about, okay, well, what can I use for this person? What approaches and tactics and strategies will work with this person on this topic at this time?
Superb. I think that this, again, blends perfectly into what I want to discuss next. Dirty tricks. So really, Simon, dirty tricks. We've got the generic ones, the lies, the nibbling, procrastinating, hot and cold with individuals, and tergiversation, for example.
I think we need to explain tergiversation.
Go on, mate.
Tergiversation is just a really complicated word for that slippery, slimy, never quite sure what you're dealing with. What did my grandmother used to call it? Oh, it's like knitting with fog. Well, my grandmother used to say, talking to her is like knitting with fog, she used to say. And I think that's brilliant. So you're trying to negotiate with this person, and you can never sort of get a straight answer. And the way to deal with that is to be very specific in your questioning. So never ask vague questions, never ask general questions, and repeat your questioning. You really want to look for a definitive question and get a definitive answer. So if they're slippery, you have to do the sort of, I don't like Jeremy Paxman, but his interview technique was really good. He never allowed an individual to slip away. Come back to the question, ask again, go for the detail, go for the specifics. And that's how you deal with somebody that's doing this tergiversation, slippery, knitting with fog sort of approach. Sorry, I thought we'd just better explain that.
No, it's superb. I got to be fair, Simon. I stole that word from you when we've had previous meetings. So I love it. Absolutely love that word. And then I think it's very valuable that we have an explanation.
And I think the other one that you mentioned, Ben, was nibbling. Because this is a weird one, because we do this as well. And actually, this is something that lots of trade unionists are taught. And to be honest, I teach this, trying to get a little bit of an agreement and get that point agreed, and then that point agreed, and then that word agreed, and that bit agreed, and then we build it up. So we're narrowing the employer's ability to sneak out of the way. And I think we just need to recognise that they might be doing that to us. They might be nibbling at us, getting us to agree to little bits. So yes, it's a tactic we might use, but also recognise it's a tactic that might be used back on us. We nibble away at an agreement. We nibble away at when we're looking at pay, we'll try and get this little bit of the pay deal agreed, and then that little bit of the pay deal agreed. So nibbling's an interesting one because it's a useful tactic for us, but it can be used back against us.
It's definitely something I've seen used quite a lot, to be fair. Yeah. It's something I've used in meetings when discussing with people as well. And have said things, oh, can I have that minuted? And that's because they've got them to say something you want, take it. I'm running with that, I'm getting it minuted, that's agreed. Then you move on to your next point. And as you said, it's a very good way of building to the final product that you're trying to get to. So I was just wondering, Simon, what tricks do you think are used the most regularly and people are most likely to come across?
I think there's a few that I see regularly. I still see them. I saw them, I don't know what, we're nearly coming up for nearly 40 years ago now. So in the 1980s, we were still seeing these tricks. There used to be let's call him Fred. There used to be a manager. He was the chair of the Health and Safety Committee. And he always claimed he didn't have authority to make any decisions. So you'd spend hours negotiating with him, and he'd go, okay, well, we'll pass that to the senior leadership team. We'll pass that to the management team. So claiming no authority. And I see that a lot. I see that constantly saying, this has to go somewhere else. Yes, I'm happy to have discussed this. But and a little bit we do that sometimes when we say, oh, this has to go to the membership. And that might be genuine. The members are the ones that should be making those decisions on those collective bargaining issues. It's their contracts, their livelihoods. But also, I think sometimes we do that back to the employer. We do that sort of, I don't have the authority. So I think that's one of the common ones. Sometimes managers not applying the authority. And my point has always been, well, why the hell am I bothering talking to you? Why am I talking to you? Why can't I talk to the person with authority? I think the other thing that we see a lot is threats. Threats to you as an individual, threats to the union, threats to terms and conditions. Oh yeah, we could do that, but it'll affect this. And I only have two approaches to threats. One is to either completely ignore them, because actually one of the really important things about negotiating is I can't completely control you, but I can completely control me. I am able to control myself. So, if they're threatening me, if they're trying to intimidate me, I can control my response to that. So one of the things I try not to do is I try not to respond to threats. I try to recognize them, but I don't. It's sort of counterintuitive because you want to threaten back. But, you just think about the psychology of conflict. The moment you threaten somebody else, unless you've got a much bigger stick than them, they're going to back down. And even if you've got a bigger stick, they still might not back down. They might come back with another threat. I remember one of my first full-time officers telling me that in the face of utter disaster, defiance is the union's only recourse. And I really like that. He used to have this little picture of an owl sort of swooping down on a mouse, and the mouse was giving two fingers up to this owl. And he got this trade union defiance is the only recourse in the face of total disaster. And I quite like that. But also I have to recognize that sometimes if you respond to a threat with another threat, we're just going to butt heads. We're going to get digging in and entrenching. And so try not to respond to the threat on an emotional level. Try and think, okay, what's the reality here? What's the likelihood they're going to do this? How damaging could this be? If they do go ahead with this, what could happen? What could happen to me? What could happen to staff? So I think threats are one of those things you have to be really taking emotion out of it as much as possible, trying to be really realistic about what the chances are of this going ahead. Try not to react. Don't counter-threaten, because I often don't think that helps. And the other thing I think about counter-threatening, I talk sometimes about something called bargaining residue. And this is the idea that every time you leave a set of negotiations, you've left an experience behind, and that experience might be there next time you come and talk to them. And I often talk about the example of having to negotiate with a really unreasonable manager twice in the same day. So I was doing, actually, it was sort of one-to-one negotiations. It was representation. It was the same manager. And in the morning, I was having to talk to him and HR about an appraisal appeal where we caught this manager just shamelessly making up lies about a member of staff. He didn't like her. He wanted her out of the team. So he'd given her this really terrible appraisal that was going to lead to sort of a disciplinary capability process. And we managed to prove that everything he'd said negative was just completely made up by him. I mean, it was just a complete lie. Okay. And it's one of the few times in my negotiation life I almost lost my temper with him. I mean, I really almost got up and thumped him because he was just making this woman's life hell on complete fabrication. And we even got him to admit that everything was a lie. But in the afternoon, I was meeting with him about a sickness review where I needed him to be supportive and sympathetic about an individual who had a life-limiting condition. And I needed him to be going a little beyond the quite poor policy we had at the time. So while we're trying to negotiate a better policy, we're trying to get individual managers to be a bit more sympathetic. And it really brought home to me the fact that I couldn't avoid the implications of the way I dealt with him in the morning for that second member in the afternoon. So if I could have taken a tactic for that member of staff for the appraisal appeal that absolutely destroyed him, I mean, I could have just destroyed him completely. His confidence, I could have made him look like a complete fool. I could have ripped him apart in the morning, almost cost him his job in the morning. But then 2 hours later, I'm going to come back in the afternoon and go, hi, I'm the guy that gave you a complete kicking this morning. Could you now be a nice, caring person? And it doesn't matter what he thinks about that member of staff. In his head, he's going to be going, no, you kicked me in the morning, Simon. I'm going to be obnoxious to you, therefore obnoxious to the member. And so, you have to remember that, and I always think about this in terms of responding to threats and antagonism, that I need to be careful about how I respond to that, because at some point I'm going to need to sit down with these people and negotiate with them again. What do I want them to bring in from the last time? Do I want them to bring in being annoyed with me, being angry? And maybe I do. And if I do, that's okay. But I need to have thought that through.
It affects the relationship, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It comes back to that thing we talked about, relationship. The other thing I don't see this very often, but it is worth talking about. It's the sort of aberrant behaviour that you sometimes get. I mean, I told this story so many times. I used to have a chief executive that in pay negotiations would take a toy car out of his pocket and start driving it up and down the desk in front of us, the board table in front of us, making car noises. So he would be in the middle of pay negotiations. The first time it happens, you think, you're sort of looking around the rest of the team and looking at HR and other managers thinking, what's happening? What's just happened?
Are we actually here?
Yeah, absolutely. And then he once climbed onto the board table and started tap dancing on the board table by humming a show tune. And you think, what the hell's going on? And it was all distraction tactics. So I call these distraction tactics. Oh, he didn't want to talk about pay. And you think, well, why have I just said? Where are we at in the negotiations? Why has he suddenly felt the need to just be really aberrant? And it might be that they're throwing a spanner in the works. It might be that they're trying to distract me. It might be that they're criticising the team or our appearance or the way we're speaking. I mean, I once told a manager he was asinine. Well, actually, technically, I told him his idea was asinine. And for those of you that don't know what asinine means, it means behaving like a donkey, behaving like an ass. And he come out with this comment. I said, that's a very asinine comment. Oh, you've just called me a donkey. You've just called me an ass. And you have to be careful that, because he wasn't upset by that. What he wanted to do was have an argument about whether or not I'd called him asinine or not. He wanted to spend time arguing about that, not discussing the topic. So I think these distraction techniques, I see them very, very commonly. And you can't control them, but I can control me. So I just ignored this guy in the end, and I've seen it a lot with people try to come up with some distractions, comment out the window, or I've got to answer my phone. You just ignore it. You just stick to your plan, stick to your approach, that very professional approach. Don't get drawn into any of this nonsense. So some of those weird, dirty tricks. I think it's like shouting and trying to be dominant and intimidating. It just don't respond, don't shout back. I was once negotiating an harassment policy at a multi-union workplace. I think this was back in the 90s, and we had about 17 trade unions on the staff council. It was just mad. And we're negotiating an harassment policy, anti-bullying policy. And we were sticky. It was getting sticky. We really weren't getting much movement. This negotiator from one of the engineering unions started screaming and shouting and banging on the desk and the table, thumping this negotiating table and screaming at the top of his voice. Shouting in the workplace is never acceptable. You should never tolerate screaming and shouting and intimidation in the workplace. I'm thinking, mate, you're doing exactly. You can't.
That's what you preach, mate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you could see management on the other side of the table just looking and going, "Nah, you just lost the argument, fella. Completely lost the argument."
Ruined. It's over, mate. I'm sorry, but it is.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, so we talked about relationship and we talked about that HR management approach to staff and then our approach to us. I think one of the other things that I sometimes think is, I think you talked about it hot and cold, and seeing that sometimes. So coming in, being really friendly with us sometimes and then not friendly. So the chief exec that used to play with a toy car, he had a little notebook and he would find out personal details about the trade union reps and staff, and he would make notes about them. And we found this out quite a way into this negotiating relationship, several months into it. And he would try and be really friendly with you. I mean, he was one of the most awful, evil, obnoxious managers I've ever negotiated with. He didn't lose any sleep about sacking staff. He didn't lose any sleep about making huge groups of people redundant, about saying, let's close this unit. I don't care. Just shut it. I don't care what it affects the business. I've had enough of it. And he not bat an eyelid, nothing. But he came across really personably when you first met him. And he would know, how's your family? He would know the names of my kids. He would make notes about, if we'd met them and he'd say, how are the kids? And if I'd said, my daughter isn't very well, it's been quite a tough week, he would make a note of that. So the next time you met him, he would seem really personable, how's your daughter? Is she better now? And he would do this with staff. Staff thought he was lovely. He would walk round the workplace once or twice a month, chatting to staff, and he would remember your name and your kids. No, he wrote it all down. It was a front to seem really personable. And that was hard for us as negotiators, because often we'd be saying, they're talking about making 30, 40 people here redundant. And they'd say, Harry, let's call him Harry. Does Harry know? If only Harry knew, let's talk to Harry. Because he seemed this really caring guy. And that was really, we had to come up with some really good ways of making people sure our membership knew about these are the ideas he was proposing, the way he believed, not fall into that trap of thinking he liked us and being friendly and chatty with him. It was all just a trick to try and unsettle us, keep us off balance. And what we had to do is make sure we maintained our balance. We knew what we wanted. We knew what we were doing. We knew how we were going to go around doing it and not get distracted by any of these other things. And also think about the very careful messaging to members about what we were asking for, how they were responding, what they were giving us back. So being as open as we could with our membership about the negotiations, so that we didn't get caught looking like the bad guys here, because that's definitely what he wanted us to do, that sort of dirty trick, anti-union, union busting sort of dirty tricks.
Definitely something I've seen occurring, especially the managers going around and, acting like everyone's best friend, but really they're the individual making the calls at the big top of the table, saying, actually, we're getting rid of these people, we're doing that. And I can imagine then, Simon, it's difficult there. Members who think that individual's great and tell them that actually it's this person that's done that, because they think, no, it's not. It wouldn't be him, Harry, for instance, would it? He wouldn't do it. So I think that's awesome. It's definitely.
And that's why understanding the relationship between the employer and staff helps us understand their relationship between the employer and the union, us and our membership and potential members. We have to understand all those dynamics, because if we pitch ourselves in the wrong place, we look incompetent, or we look like we're the bad guys, or we look like we're the troublemakers here. And that affects members' support, because I always think we have moral authority in the negotiations. Managers are there by purpose of their job. They're there just because they're a manager. We are democratically elected to represent our members, and that gives us moral authority. but we have to make sure that we're working with our members and our potential members to make sure that that moral authority really exists. I find it really empowering sitting there as a negotiator and thinking, I'm elected to represent this group of workers. You're just doing this because it's a job. And I'm elected. I am giving
and
you
you've
more
actually got to be
authority than you.
representative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you've got to be representative of the whole workforce. And that's something, as you say, you take pride in. You know, you're not doing it for you. You never were. You're doing it for the greater good and the wider movement and the wider workforce. And that, as you said, that's something that I think is worth remembering for all our trade union officials. You know, is you should take pride in what you do for that reason.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Communicating effectively is key to negotiating effectively. This guide, created exclusively for community reps, is full to the brim with helpful tips and tricks to help you communicate effectively with a wide variety of audiences. Get your free copy today by emailing education@community-tu.org. That's education@community-tu.org.
So, and following on, Simon, so, you know, talking about the relationships and the dirty tricks that are used, how do you think that the values and beliefs of individuals impact negotiations as well then? Because that fits well with the relationship as such, doesn't it? And understanding the individual.
Yeah.
Do you think, you know, people's personal beliefs and values affect negotiating as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see a little bit when we talked about those XY managers. If you remember back earlier, we were talking about that, the managers that think people are fundamentally lazy, or the managers that think if you're just nice to everybody, they'll all be really hard workers. That affects how they interact with you, what they think about the trade union, their attitude to trade unions, their beliefs about collective representation, their beliefs about the rights of workers, their beliefs about you as an individual, their beliefs about, you know, we touched on earlier about their attitudes around gender, for example, or ethnicity. That affects how they interact with you. That affects how they view what you're saying. It affects how much importance and weight they give to the things you're saying. I mean, I remember negotiating with a very good trade unionist, unfortunately no longer with us, Pauline. She was a brilliant trade unionist, and she represented domestic staff in the hospital. And I remember when I first sort of took over as branch secretary, going to negotiations with her. And I'd not really got involved with negotiating for that group of staff before. And we went in and Pauline was brilliant. She made this really articulate, well laid out, well resourced, good evidence argument about why something shouldn't happen and what should happen in its alternative. And the male manager opposite sort of listened and then dismissed. And I thought, no, this is brilliant. So I did what I always do. I went, no, listen, here you go. This is what we're saying. And I pretty much said the same thing she said. And he went, oh, yeah. I thought, I can see some merit in that. And we started to move negotiations. And then, you know, if I'm really honest, I didn't spot that as a gender issue initially. I'll be honest about this. And then a couple of meetings later on, same sort of thing. I've noticed this happens every time. Pauline will say something and she'll say it well and she'll put a point of view across and I go, okay, well, what's different here? And I thought, well, maybe it's potentially two things. One is he's a manager, she's a cleaner, I'm a nurse. So I'm coming from maybe a professional background. Maybe he's looking at me and going, oh, you're a nurse, so you have professional status, you know, and maybe it was that. And I thought, actually, it isn't that. It's a gender thing. So then we started to, his attitude to her, and I'm thinking when she's representing workers on her own, then he's still got this attitude. So what we had to do is work on his attitude to women. So we really had to, you know, make sure that we were addressing that. We were changing his attitude. We were calling it out. I was backing Pauline up. I was clearly saying, she's just said that. Why, you know, we had to think about ways of pointing this out to him, and we moved him eventually. We moved the way he dealt with Pauline, certainly, and we, you know, after I left that workplace and went to work for a union, he's keep in touch with people. You know, well, how's it going? And you know, probably say he's changed he's changed his attitude. So you have to understand people, because you don't. I said this earlier. You don't negotiate with an organisation. You negotiate with people. So the way they think and feel. And this is why I said right at the top, I talked about the difference between negotiations and negotiating. And this is why, for me, negotiating is really important, because it's about the way people think and feel. I want to change the way they see the world. I don't necessarily need them to see the world the way I see the world, but I do need them to see the world the way I want them to see the world.
Yeah. Be on the same page as that.
Like me. I want them to think like the way I want them to think.
Yeah.
And so there's this idea of something called principled negotiations. When things get sticky, when things get difficult, you talk about the underlying principles. You know, so I've seen this negotiating with large international organizations around sexual harassment. When I can't get them, me and the union can't get them to change their approach to dealing with sexual harassment complaints, we have to go right back to the very beginning. We have to talk about their attitudes to women. We have to talk about their attitudes to sex. We have to talk about their attitudes to women in the workplace, to complaints of sexual harassment. Because if I don't deal with those underlying attitudes, I'm never going to get them to move on the way we deal with it, with a better procedure, with better support for witnesses, for better supports for complainants, for better supports for the targets of harassment. So if I can't get them to move on the detail of the policy, for example, what I try to do is drag them back and understand where they're coming from. Their attitudes to the whole subject, their attitudes to me, their attitudes to other people they're negotiating with. Because then maybe I can work on those things. And if I can work on those things, then that'll help move them on other topics or other areas. And I saw this with a director of HR on complaints around harassment and support for individuals making a complaint. So in this particular workplace, when you'd made a complaint of harassment, there was an investigation. And then you as the complainant didn't hear anything else. You were never involved after that. You made your complaint, you were interviewed, and then they went away and they went through the disciplinary process or not. But you never got to find out. You never got to find out whether the person got a disciplinary sanction. And if they got dismissed, you'd notice they weren't in the workplace anymore. But short of that, you didn't find anything out. And we've saying this is terrible. This is undermining people's trust that you're taking action against harassers. And the director of HR kept saying, but we do. We've dismissed 2 harassers in the last 6 months. We've sanctioned 7 harassers. It's a big workplace. It's got thousands of people in it. So we take sanctions against people. I said, but nobody knows. So let's think about this. So we had to go right back to the fundamental principles of her view of the rights of witnesses, her view of harassment, her view of the balance between the rights of those people accused of harassment, and they do have rights, to a fair process and a fair hearing, and the rights of people that have made the complaint. And then we talked about her view of the trustworthiness of workers. So we spent about 3 weeks working on the way she viewed all those things. And then she came into a meeting and she went, I've been thinking about this. We need to publish every 6 months a newsletter of the disciplinary sanction, the number of cases we've investigated, the number of disciplinary sanctions and the types of sanctions we applied to those cases, so that people know we're taking action. And the way we moved her was not just to keep banging on about you need to say something. We moved her on changing her attitude to the victims of harassment, changed her attitude to confidentiality. We changed her attitude to women in the workplace. So we worked on all that, and then that helped her move. So, as I said, you negotiate with people, you don't negotiate with organisations. So I need to know who they are and what they believe in. And what they don't believe.
It got her on board, didn't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah.
You know, it made her realise that this would only benefit the organisation by displaying this and showing people that this will not be tolerated, this behaviour. And that has a positive knock-on effect. So, I think that's really, really interesting, Simon. And
sorry, just before you know, and it also links back into identifying what that person cares about. Do they, as an individual, do they care about their status? Do they care about looking like they won? Do they care about looking like the idea from them? I might be able to get them to move on a particular topic or issue by thinking about their motivations to a success, to an outcome. So again, it just links back.
Are you trying to sort of please those images, as bad as that sounds then, Simon? To get the result you want in a way, or just to understand it so that you can utilise it?
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to please people. I don't necessarily want to please the motivation, but I do need to understand the motivations, because I might be able to use that for my members' benefit. You know, and I might be able to say, well, does it really matter here whether it looks like the union came up with the idea or them? And if it doesn't really matter, but it really matters to management, well, let them maybe have that one. Whereas in other instances, you know, it might be, see, what she really cared about was the fact that it looked like HR were taking action. She really cared about HR being trusted. So it was useful to know that, so we could work towards finding something that showed that. So I don't always want to meet their motivations, but I do want to understand them.
Awesome. I just thought it was worth clarifying that. That was all for everybody listening. So I just wanted to sort of finish on a nice topic, and I wanted to distinguish the difference between negotiation strategy and the tactics. And I thought it was quite an interesting topic, this, and the difference between the strategy and the tactics. And I just thought if you could give us an overview of what you believe the difference between the two are, that would be awesome.
So I've always tried to think about strategy and tactics as two separate things, but they're related to each other. And strategy for me has always been the overall things I want to achieve. And I might have a range of things I want to achieve. You know, we might want a realistic cost of living pay rise. We might want to narrow or remove gender-based pay gaps. We might want to recognise unsociable hours working. We might want to support a whole range of topics around family-friendly and more flexible working models. So there might be a whole range of strategies that we want to achieve. But also in there, I personally am always going to have strategies around the relationship. So improving the relationship with the employer, improving the relationship with managers to improve that dialogue, to make it more effective for me and my members. So, strategy is always those things I want to try and achieve. Underneath that, I've got the things I could do to try and get those achievements. And that for me is tactics. So I could take this approach. I could use this argument. I could try and offer them this. I could try and give them the win here. I could try and make them look in a good light. They're the things I might use to achieve them. And I think one of the things I try and always understand is if I'm negotiating or being consulted across a whole range of things as a union, then with an employer, then those things sometimes overlap, and sometimes the things I could do to achieve them don't always match up. So, if you go back to that conversation where I had about that manager, where I had a meeting in the morning where, frankly, I could have given him a really good kicking, and in the afternoon I need him to be kind. That's a strategy tactic issue, because the strategy is to get the best for both members, to make sure that I get the best I can for both those members. The tactics I choose, I could have chosen a tactic in the morning to get the best for that member that would have damaged my chances for getting the best for the second member in the afternoon. So I can't use tactics in the morning that damage my strategy in the afternoon. So I try to talk to people a lot about understanding what you're trying to achieve, narrowing that down, so broad strategy, and get narrow and narrow, so I can then go, I can actually measure that, I can pinpoint what I really want here. So it's not just a cost of living increase. I might get down to an actual figure. But behind that, I've got the things we could do to try and achieve that as negotiators, and recognizing the relationship between all those different strands. So if I'm negotiating on pay, and I'm negotiating on flexible working, and I'm negotiating on equality, and I'm negotiating on health and safety, and I'm negotiating on better release time for trade union reps, how I deal with all those topics, how I negotiate with all those topics will affect all the other ones. So I have to try and recognize that a tactic I choose here will have an impact on another objective, something else I want to achieve. And then I need to recognize that actually, can I use that tactic then? Because it might be beneficial here, but it might be damaging over there. But also, that's okay. It's okay to recognize that if I do that, it's going to damage that one, but I'm willing for that one to be damaged. I'm willing for that one to be slightly less successful than it could have been, because this one over here is much more important. It's much more important about the cost of living pay rise than it is about improving staff union reps' time off. So, okay, well, we'll use this tactic here. That will annoy the employer slightly, and it will damage chances of increasing time off for reps. But actually, the most important thing this year is getting a cost of living pay rise and keeping jobs. We can try and increase the facilities agreement at a later date. And that's what I call strategy or tactic sacrifice. I'm going to sacrifice a tactic because it'll damage the strategy. So I'm going to sacrifice a tactic I could have used with that manager in the morning because I can't afford to damage the thing in the afternoon where I need him to support it. Or I'm going to sacrifice the strategy because I have to use this tactic, because I have to win on this. I have to get something out of this. And therefore, okay, well, let's recognize we're going to take a hit here on time off for reps. That relationship's going to be a bit harder than we would want. We're not going to quite get as far as we are, and we might even just have to hold the ground on that. But we need to get something on this. So I'm going to sacrifice the strategy. So I hope I've explained that. Sometimes as negotiators, you sacrifice a strategy because that tactic's the one you have to use to get that thing, and that's the most important thing. And sometimes we sacrifice a tactic because using that tactic here would damage that strategy, and I can't afford that strategy to be.
But it's about viewing the bigger picture and understanding that some days you've got to make some sacrifices, as you said.
Yeah.
So Simon, what would your main tactics be? Your 3 best tactics for negotiating? I mean, one of the classic ones that we always touch on is the sort of unicorns and doomsday side of things. Classic. Everybody loves that. But what are your 3 favorite tactics for negotiating? You would say that's more of a fun question, really. But
yeah. So my favorite tactic is to shut up and listen. and do you know what? Most people that I teach around negotiations seem to think that the most important thing you do as a negotiator is talk. And actually, the most important thing you do as a negotiator is shut up and listen. And actually, I've been negotiating with some quite skilled negotiators recently. So I've been negotiating with international criminal defense lawyers and ambassadors recently. And actually, they're really skilled. And one of the things that they really reinforced for me, watching them, is that they shut up and they watch and listen a lot. And so for me, that's a really key tactic. Talk less, watch and listen more. The other tactic that I think is really important is specificity and knowing when to use it and when not to use it. So knowing when to ask the specific question, knowing when, and being really pointed with the questioning. Get to a yes or no answer. Be really specific about the information that you are providing to the employer as part of your evidence, as part of your backup to your argument or your reasoning. But also knowing when not to be specific, knowing when to ask the generic question to get them talking, to make a generic point to get their imagination working. So the second tactic is about specificity. And then my third tactic, well, it's not really a tactic, it's more about an approach, really. And it links back to what you were saying about doomsday and unicorns. So for me, unicorns is, in the perfect world, in this negotiations, what's the very best we could get? It'd be bright, it'd be shiny, it'd be magical, it'd be wonderful. What's the very worst that could happen? If we don't make an agreement, if we don't get anywhere, if management just did what they want, how really bad could it be? Zombie apocalypse, that sort of stuff. And somewhere in between is maybe reality, somewhere we might end up understanding those. Understanding when to go, right, let's make a deal. Because if we don't make a deal now, we're going to end up in doomsday. Anything's better than doomsday. Understanding, well, I'm not going to get to unicorn, but actually this is as close as I'm going to make a deal. Knowing when to do that, knowing when to go, okay, it might not be what we wanted. It might not be what we wanted, but if we don't make a deal here, it's going to be terrible. Or making a deal will be worse than not making a deal. Making a deal's doomsday, right? Then we're not making a deal. We're happy not to agree anything on this. And sometimes knowing when not to do something, just not do anything, it's a choice. I always remember it's not quite about negotiations, but it's about decision making. I used to be a nurse, and my first cardiac arrest, I stood at the bottom of the bed looking at this guy, and I just couldn't make a decision. And this magnificent sister came up to me, Sister Watts, one of my absolute role models in life about a lot of things. She came up to me and she said, "Simon, what are you doing?" I went, "Sister Watts, I think he's having a cardiac arrest." And she went, "Yes, and what are you doing?" I went, "I'm not doing anything, Sister Watts." Very high-pitched, panicky voice. And she went, "Okay, what are your choices?" I went, "Well, I could start resuscitation, or I could run and call for the crash team." And she said, "And what's your third choice?" I don't know. She said, "Well, you're doing your third choice. You're doing nothing. And doing nothing is a choice, Simon. So doing one or the other, is that better than doing nothing?" And I went, "Yeah." She went, "Well, do one of them then." And that was great. It's a really important lesson to me, not just as a nurse, but actually as a trade union official. Doing nothing is a choice. I can step left, I can step right in my negotiations, or I can stand still. And is stepping left or stepping right better or worse than standing still? And I have to understand that, because actually standing still might be the best thing to do. And it also, just this last comment really, it comes back to what I think are the fundamental things we do as trade unionists. I think there are only three things we're ever trying to do as trade unionists. I think we're trying to make things better. I think we're trying to defend what we have. And I think we're trying to palliate. And palliate, some of you might be familiar with palliative care.
Yeah.
So end of life care is called palliative care. What that actually means is making it less worse. That's what palliative care is about. It's not making it better. You can't be made better. It's about making that experience less terrible. And I think that's what we do as trade unionists. We try and improve the situation. We try and make things better for workers. We try and defend and hold on to what workers have got. Or we try and make what management want to do to our members less terrible. And I think for me, that goes in with my negotiation doomsday, unicorns, reality, left, right, stand still. Are we trying to make things better? Are we trying to hold what we've got, or are we trying to make things less worse? And if making things less worse is the best we can get out of that deal, then that's the time to do the deal. So recognizing that would be my other tip. Knowing where I am, what am I trying to do here? Better defend, less worse, because that'll help me go, okay, it's time to go yes, or at least stop talking, which is what I'm going to do now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Negotiations Podcast. It's thanks to reps like you getting involved in your union and telling us what you need to get the job done that we're able to host podcasts like this. If you have any ideas for any other podcasts or have any questions, email education@community-tu.org or comsteam@community-tu.org. That's education@community-tu.org or comsteam@community-tu.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next podcast.